what would that truck actually do? I mean, it would just be shot to China, wouldn't it? I mean,
well, we have no idea. The computer was a malfunction. It wasn't really going to launch itself. It was just given that wrong impression. So, yeah, we don't know what the truck would have done.
Yeah, but why would they think of putting a truck there? You know, I mean, that just doesn't make sense to me. I was just wondering what direction it was. Well, there you go. I guess that's okay.
We're a highly sophisticated military machine, you know. That's called seat-of-the-pants disarmament, I guess, or made of that. In Fukushima, in Japan, 3 reactors blow up. What do? They bring fire hoses out for riot control. And they try to shoot water onto that fuel to keep it from melting any further. I mean, 3 weeks prior to that, they were using the same hoses on protesters. So they're trying to get those reactors shut down. So they turned from the protesters to the wrecked reactors. They could have listened to the protesters.
Yeah.
So this is just one example. And there are dozens of these, illustrating how dangerous the weapons are. Most recently, just last May of 2015, I'm sorry, J7 in Colorado was indicating some sort of malfunction, so the Air Force sent a crew out, and the crew caused additional malfunction to the tune of $2 million. Oddly, this is all we know about this mishap. The Air Force is very tight-lipped about this. This $1.8 million sum, that's from the Air Force too. Who knows how much it really cost. The big scandal in this case was that a Pentagon delegation was in the missile field at the time, at that base, investigating a scandal having to do with drugs being distributed by some of the missileers among themselves. And so this separate scandal had this big Pentagon Inspector General team out there, and the local guys kept this accident a secret from the higher-ups when they were on base. So the CBS got a hold of that and made it a little bit of an embarrassing story too. But this, again, is another reason why these things need to be gotten rid of as soon as possible. And it's not just peaceniks like the Dalai Lama and others around the world calling for this now. Just this Friday, former Secretary of Defense William Perry had a nice op-ed in New York Times calling for exactly this, permanent retirement of the Minuteman missiles. Part of it, the reason is just absolute tedium, the boredom, the uselessness that these missileers endure at this job. They don't have anything to do during their shifts underground in the middle of nowhere. And so drug use, that's totally understandable in my mind. You know, they were selling ecstasy and amphetamines. It's scandalous, but who can blame the poor people? It's deathly tedious out there. The other thing that was recently divulged is cheating on proficiency examinations by the missileers, who are under extreme pressure to get a perfect score on their tests. You know, dealing with nuclear warheads that are live, that are armed, the Air Force, they want you on your tiptoes and they want a perfect score every time you do your exam. And there's such pressure that they were, once somebody got a hold of the answers, they were texting them to each other with their phones. Again, who can blame them? They need advancement. They want a promotion every year, like most people. And if they don't get that 100%, they get docked. They're not going to make that career advancement. So this involved a lot of people. 92 missileers were fired. Later on, almost the entire chain of command at this air base in Montana was relieved of duty for having tolerated or been unaware of the cheating scandal. Well, as I said, there's been a string of high-level experts now who have called for the elimination of this archaic weapon system. General Cartwright here was the chair of a pretty influential commission in 2012. High-ranking, a former vice chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That's the second highest military officer in the country. who, as I said, he published this report that was signed by Senator Chuck Hagel, who would later become the Secretary of Defense. And Chuck Hagel took some heat for that when he was up for Secretary of Defense, sitting in front of the Senate Confirmation Committee and grilling him about having signed this report. And Chuck Hagel, to his credit, stuck to his position, which is that these missiles, they said, are highly vulnerable to enemy attack. Eliminating these weapons entirely would be the best option. It would save $100 billion over the next 3 decades. So those two people are highly placed experts. And General Cartwright, just again, since 2012, he's been on the lecture circuit and in the opinion pages. In August 15th, he had an op-ed with Bruce Blair in the New York Times reiterating this call to eliminate land-based missiles. Here's Mr. Hagel, who eventually says these weapons have become more a part of the problem than any solution. It sounds like a peacenik. These people are hard-bitten militarists, you know, talking like this. Secretary Perry, now, who was Secretary of Defense under Bill Clinton, he helped oversee the elimination of some of the missiles. He joined his Soviet counterpart here in Missouri and watched the implosion of one of the missiles there. He now says, quote, ICBMs aren't necessary. That's intercontinental ballistic missiles. Aren't necessary. They're not needed. Any reasonable definition of deterrence will not require them. They're simply, here, this is a scary thought, they're too easy to launch on bad information. They're destabilizing. Nuclear weapons no longer provide for our security, they endanger it. He made that speech on December 3rd, about 3 days after we published the book. Too bad couldn't have made it a little earlier, but we think of it as an exclamation point for our new book. But these are the people we're up against. They call themselves the ICBM Coalition. We call them the Doomsday Lobby. And these 6 or 8 or 12 senators, they have a big vested interest in bringing all those hundreds of millions of dollars into their states, the military contracts, and the Air Force bases that run entire congressional districts. You know how it is. But it's nefarious. It's not a jobs program. It's supposed to be for defense of the United States, which they obviously don't provide anymore, if they ever did. The voices of reason, say Hagel and Secretary Perry and General Cartwright, they're being foiled right now by these senators. One example I'll share is that in 2012, the Russians proposed a 400 more missile reduction in the total overall arsenal. Cut the active warheads from 1,950 to 1,550. You know, not a radical proposal, just another minor reduction. It would have meant a little something. These senators went to bat against this proposal like crazy. Something so reasonable and moderate. Max Baucus, who preceded John Tester in Montana, he complained that the cut would have meant closing a missile base, probably the one in his state. And they foiled it. It didn't come to fruition. And Bill Hartung, who works for the Center for Responsive Politics, he's been investigating contributions from military contractors to these particular senators. And he's the one who came up with that earlier slide, $513,000 just in the last senatorial circuit, or cycle, from the weapons contractors to the senators. Well, these people are a tiny minority, aren't they? They can be voted out of office. I'm sorry. And they need to be foiled, though. We need to take a lesson from some other Cold Warriors, and I like to finish with this most cold of the Cold Warriors. Paul Nitze was Ronald Reagan's chief national security advisor, right-wing anti-Soviet hawk his entire life. But after retiring, He wrote a scathing denunciation of his own life's work in the New York Times. He said, "I see no compelling reason why we should not unilaterally get rid of our nuclear weapons. To maintain them adds nothing to our security. I can think of no circumstances under which it would be wise for the U.S. to use nuclear weapons, even in retaliation for their prior use against us." End quote. A complete undoing of deterrence theory. And who can, if you study long enough, you know that the use of these weapons recoils against the people who shoot them. The fallout is uncontrollable. The economic, agricultural, psychological devastation comes back on the shooters. And that's why Paul Nietzsche could finally admit that. In the conclusion of his op-ed, he said, "Our conventional forces are so overwhelming that nuclear weapons are completely redundant anyway." And now, after having taken over Afghanistan and taken over Iraq, we know that conventional forces can completely take over other countries and that nuclear weapons are perfectly unnecessary. So maybe Paul Nietzsche's little speech can be an epitaph for the nuclear arsenal, or maybe our book. Well, thanks again for inviting me, and